Welcome to Byline Wildfile, a podcast that goes beyond the headlines of Wyoming's most important news stories. I'm your host, Claire Schnatterbeck. On today's episode, we'll be joined by reporter Dustin Bleizeffer to talk about how school districts are preparing to reopen this fall in light of COVID-19.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready to attempt to answer some questions.
Awesome. Well, welcome to the podcast. Wyoming has more than 40 school districts, and they're currently preparing to start their fall classes. What kinds of approaches are districts in Wyoming taking in regard to COVID-19 safety protocols?
I guess it can be mostly described as a wait and see approach. They're using a lot of their protocols and guidelines that they developed, but they also know that things are changing quickly in terms of the transmission of the Delta variant, which is more of a threat for younger people. And so, so far, school districts following state guidance in, recommending mask wearing, but they're certainly steering clear of mandating any sort of mask wearing or vaccinations. And in fact, the governor issued a directive against requiring vaccinations. Masking is still a big question, even though right now, I don't think any school districts are mandating it, but they know that a mandate could come as things change. If the state were to issue an order, then the schools would be required to follow that. But so far, they've really kind of dusted off their COVID-19 protocols to prevent transmission, and they're just kind of trying to remain flexible.
Can you talk a little bit about how Wyoming handled public education and COVID safety in the 2021 school year? So what sort of protocols did they use?
In the 2020-21 school year, there was a statewide order that required masks. Schools were obligated to follow that. And then toward the end of the year, several school districts began to apply for a variance to that mask mandate. Those requests for variance came from a lot of pressure from parents and others in individual communities who didn't want masking to be a requirement. Right at the tail end of the school year, the state did grant several of these variances to allow school districts to roll that back from a requirement to guidance. I think there was only one district variance application that was denied because the state health department determined that their COVID risk and their COVID instances and cases just didn't back up granting a variance.
So you've mentioned how, state actors have had an influence of this. How much power or authority does the state have to dictate what these school districts do? And what has been the stance of state officials on this matter for this coming school year?
The state health officer has the authority, along with the governor, to issue an order regarding masking. That's definitely in the state's authority. But as we saw last year, as a number of these orders were beginning to come out, there was a lot of pushback politically at every level. At school board meetings, definitely a lot of pushback directed the state health officer and the governor's office. And so it felt like as things have improved in 2021, that the governor's office felt some relief in being able to roll back some of those health orders. And in fact, I think it was sometime in May that the masking requirement for schools was rolled back. And so as we enter the fall semester, no school is obligated to mandate mask wearing, among students and staff and visitors.
How has Wyoming's approach differed from other school districts or other state officials across the country?
I would say Wyoming's not alone. Certainly across the country, there's been a lot of pushback against masking mandates. It's certainly the case here. There are, a lot of communities and states that are a lot more willing to make that a mandate. But so far, that doesn't seem to be the case in Wyoming, at least politically speaking. However, in some of my follow-up reporting and some of the conversations I've had since this story, I've talked to trustees who feel like they're just caught in a lose-lose situation here. Actually, I had one trustee tell me, I don't mind making an unpopular decision. I do mind making a decision that might get me shot. For a board of trustees to push forward a mask mandate in this time just seems like a losing proposition. It would turn into a big fight, and that they wouldn't get any other work done that's also important, and that they're also obligated to take on. There's the sense that school boards are kind of relenting to this pressure and really just trying to strongly encourage mask wearing. Interestingly, here in Natrona County School District number 1, in their guidance that they've rolled out just last week, one of their top lines is that they're going to enforce a no bullying standard when it comes to mask wearing. Whether staff or students choose to wear a mask or not, they will not allow that to become an issue where people are bullied about their decisions.
So, as you've touched on, masking in schools has become very controversial. Can you walk us through the arguments on either side of the issue and how the debate has played out in Wyoming?
Well, on one side, there's this notion that masks just simply are not needed, that it's an unnecessary measure, particularly for younger people. They believe the science just doesn't back it up, that it helps prevent the transmission, or that COVID is that serious enough of a public health risk. But on the other side is the science. Vaccines and masking are, in fact, very effective at preventing transmission, as well as lessening the severity of illness when somebody does get sick. And so you have the national CDC guidance really on one side saying that, in this surge of the Delta variant, it's really recommended that whether you're vaccinated or not, you should be wearing a mask indoors. The state seems to recognize that and is also encouraging those measures as guidelines, but they're certainly not going to issue a mandate, at least so far. It feels like the governor's office is really shy about going back down the road of issuing orders of any kind.
So you mentioned the debate over vaccines. How has Wyoming's low vaccination rate played into this discussion over masking in schools and just general opinions about the COVID-19 pandemic?
In terms of vaccination rates, our vaccination rate in Wyoming is about the third lowest in the nation. Our state health officer says this month that that's very concerning. That just increases the risk of transmission. And then you add to that a resistance to wearing masks indoors. It's a huge concern. I was talking about, this comment that a trustee mentioned to me. I do want to add that I also talked to a parent who was really concerned that the school district where their child goes is not going to mandate masks. That really worries them because their 93-year-old mother lives in their same household. They're worried that if there's not a masking mandate and their student goes to school in person, that they'll probably move their mother to another relative's house in California. And so these are some of the decisions that families are wrestling with. Additionally, parents are really confused too, because, for example, there's one school district that asks parents to sign a contract at the beginning of each school year that they're going to, help meet requirements. And one of those, reads that by opting to attend school or any school related activity in person, my student will abide by all COVID-19 health and safety guidelines, policies, and procedures in accordance with the CDC, the state, and local health organizations. For some parents, that's really confusing, because if you're following the guidance from the CDC, then you're required to wear a mask. But yet the district and the state, they don't want to be identified as the ones making that requirement. So there seems to be this kind of workaround that some districts are trying to attempt by saying, okay, well, if you're going to enter our schools, you must follow the CDC guidance. That means wearing a mask. Yeah, parents are really confused about, what's required of them and how others are actually going to interpret those requirements. Is it guidance, or is it a requirement to follow CDC guidance? It's really confusing for some parents.
So for parents wondering about what school will look like for their children in the fall, it's just a matter of wait and see.
Last year, the state and schools moved very quickly to offer online and distance learning options. Those options remain in place. Any student can opt for that, without having to meet any sort of requirement. That remains an option, but both parents and teachers, they really want to see students in class, because that's the most effective way to learn. We're dealing with coming back from at least a year of lost learning opportunities. When the pandemic struck and really reached its height, it was a major distraction for teachers and students alike. And so there's this big learning loss that teachers and parents and students are eager to begin trying to make up for. As it stands right now, school districts do have the authority to impose a mask mandate and other mandates regarding the transmission of COVID. Right now, it doesn't seem there's a lot of appetite for that, but they do have the authority right now. If the state does issue an order, then they're obligated to follow that state order.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? I know this is a developing story as we go into the fall, so I'm sure there's a lot.
Right now, school district officials are really wrestling with, genuinely wanting to hear and understand parents' concerns, whether that's a concern they don't want their student to have to wear a mask, or a concern that they do want to see more masking, because this is a deadly public health issue. They're really caught in a difficult place right now. And you'll notice that, well, I noticed, I went to a school board trustee meeting in Casper earlier this week, where a lot of parents came to offer some comments. I would say out of about 8 parents who's addressed the trustees, all of them urged the trustees to not issue a mandate. And some even said that, if a mandate does come down from the state level, that they wanted those trustees to ignore that order. And if they didn't, that, they would definitely be hearing from the parents. And in fact, there's been a lot of vitriol and impassioned comments directed at trustees. At the meeting I was at in Casper earlier this week, there were 2 police officers there. I don't think that's a normal thing that happens at trustee meetings, but it might be the norm for now.
Thanks, Dustin, and thanks for listening to Byline Wildfile. Visit wildfile.com to read stories on back-to-school preparations and other vital Wyoming news.